Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on COVID-19 and international law. We're now streaming live and the event is being recorded. For those unable to join today's live stream, a recording will be made available to download subsequently. My name is Constantinos Yiallourides, I'm a research fellow with BIICL, and I will be your host this afternoon. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions during the conversation. My colleagues, Christine and Jean-Pierre, and myself will make a selection of questions to be addressed by our two speakers after about 30 minutes into their conversation. That said, BIICL is extremely honored to bring together two very special guests, the international lawyer, author of the award-winning East-West Street and the most recently released The Rat Line, Professor Philippe Sands, and the global health law expert, former HWO legal advisor, and author of the seminal textbook on this topic, Professor Gian Luca Burci. So today, in conversation, they will seek to explore what went wrong with this pandemic and what can we do about it. Is the spread of coronavirus a story of overconfidence and lack of preparation on the part of states and international organizations? Could they have known? Did they know but didn't listen to early warnings? Is there still a chance for them to listen and inform global health policies going forward? And crucially, what do we need to do in international law to improve things for now and for next time? Because there will be a next time, 5 or 10 years down the road, there will be a next time. Now, I would like to invite Professor Sands to start off today's conversation. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to this live stream. It's a first for me, probably like everybody. You are in lockdown at home somewhere in the world and making use of new technologies. I'm absolutely delighted to be in conversation with Gian Luca Burci. He was the legal advisor for the WHO for many years. He has unparalleled expertise in this area. I do not. I'm not an expert in health law. I've read myself in. I'm getting to know it a little bit more. It's an absolutely fascinating area. We propose to proceed in the following way. He and I will have a conversation for about 30 minutes on a variety of topics related to the big theme. And we will then open it up to questions for the audience, which you should use the arrangements on Zoom to send them in, and they'll be curated and put to us. Can I also thank BIICL, the British Institute. As I explained to them earlier, I can't think of a moment in time when international law has been more important, when cooperation is more important, and BIICL plays an absolutely huge role. It's a fantastic organization. I'm very proud to support it, and I hope you too will continue to support it in a multitude of ways. Gian Luca, greetings and welcome.
Thank you.
You are in Geneva, I think. You teach there, you're a professor there. Let's begin at the beginning in a sense, because for many of us, we don't have a deep background on the rules that applied when this COVID-19 story began in Wuhan at some point in late 2019. So can you tell us briefly, the international health regulations, how do they operate, or how should they operate in the circumstances the world found itself in at the end of 2019?
Yes, first of all, many thanks for inviting me, and also thanks to BIICL for this great opportunity. The international health regulations were last revised in 2005, and that's what we have on the shelves right now. They are the latest version of a long history of international cooperation in the field of health, in particular the prevention and control of epidemics. So the WHO itself adopted the international health regulation, the first version, 1951, and then they were revised several times. So we go back in time. But the current version is, I think, would be very contemporary and quite revolutionary compared to the old approach, because it's very open-ended. It doesn't apply to an exhaustive list of diseases. It covers any event that can spread disease internationally, can also be a nuclear accident, can be even an act of bioterrorism. and is based on a few principles. First, to have like a joint approach to surveillance, to detect quickly if something is happening. Second, to have a system of alert, to alert the world that a certain stage of risk has been reached. And third, to provide guidance for coordinated response, basically delegating to WHO the authority to give recommendations of what states should do to prevent, contain, and control the event. So going back to your question, China notified WHO of this coronavirus on the 31st of December, literally at the end of the year. And from
just to be clear, that is under Article 6 of the international health regulations. There is an obligation to notify as soon as you are aware of what precisely.
So there's, again, since it applies to all kinds of possible events, the criteria are relatively flexible. There is an algorithm that is an annex to the IHR. The states must use, it's an obligation, when they detect a health event that meets certain characteristics, unusual, particularly lethal, next to an international border and so on. When a number of boxes have been checked, they must notify WHO without delay and then continue to cooperate, to provide data, information on what they are doing, have they isolated the pathogen, what their findings are.
Did that happened on the 31st of December, you said. On Correct. The basis of what is available to you right now, did that notification take place in a timely way?
Well, as you know, there's a lot of talk, partly anecdotal, partly based on evidence, that the local authority in Wuhan knew about this much earlier, probably as early as November. And for a number of reasons, probably political reasons, the notification to WHO happened only at the end of December. So again, you will never find a sort of a smoked gun kind of evidence, also because of the level of control in China on the internet. But there is enough evidence to suggest that China knew or should have known earlier than the 31st of December.
Is there any mechanism available which allows the WHO, if it suspects something is happening before a notification has taken place, to intervene?
Yes, there is, and that's a big novelty of the IHR, and it reflects the practice of the WHO Secretariat preceding the revision, and that is a possibility to use non-state sources. I think it's Article 9 or 10 of the IHR, and that would be internet-based, basically rumors and noise over the internet, but it can also be NGOs, newspapers, other international organizations, and so on. Any hint of a health event, and WHO must ask the state in question to verify. Basically, we heard this, please verify and report back to us. That's an obligation under the IHR. And if the state doesn't comply, WHO can put its information on the web, so make them public, even against the will of the state. That's fairly powerful. In the case of China, evidently it didn't work, probably because, again, the level of Chinese control over the online media in China is very powerful. So it's quite possible that there was no possibility to detect that before the Chinese went public at the end of December.
Okay, so the notification is received. What happens next?
Then there is literally a dynamic process, both between WHO and the state that notifies, to try to find out more on the characteristics of the event, but also towards other states. So WHO kept putting on the web notices and alerts, basically reflecting the knowledge that WHO had at that particular point. And as you know, one of the controversial aspects is when did WHO know or should have known that there was human-to-human transmission, that there were already community clusters, so that the thing was getting out of control.
Can you just, sorry, Gian Luca, can you just explain a little bit more about that? The test is human-to-human transmission is a catalyst for further actions to be taken.
It depends on the context. IHR is very contextual. There's no one size fits all. But in the case of a respiratory disease like a coronavirus, that would be definitely a test. Right. Because as you can see, it spreads very easily through aerosol and through close contact with somebody who is sick.
Right. So WHO receives the notification. It then engages in an internal, internal review. What does it do internally? What should it have done? and did it do it adequately?
I think WHO, if you look again at the chronology, acted fairly quickly and again, quite diligently on the basis of the information it had. In my view, and that's not a problem, it's sort of a fault of WHO, it's a design problem in the IHR. The formal alert under the IHR is what we call a public health emergency of international concern. And that implies that the event is already sufficiently acute and probably already spreading internationally. And that's too late. So even though WHO made quite a number of alerts and analyses, if the IHR were more context sensitive, if they really had like a step of intermediate alerts, probably a formal alert could have been given earlier and with more chances of success than doing when the disease was already spreading outside China.
So just to be very specific on this, I'm just reading the text, and just to say that I hope that after this live stream is finished, our BIICL team will send a short email to every participant identifying the relevant core provisions that we refer to in this conversation so that you are aware of them. But I'm reading Article 12 of the International Health Regulations. The Director General shall determine, on the basis of the information received, in particular from the state party within whose territory an event is occurring, whether an event constitutes a public health emergency of international concern, a PHEIC, a FIC, in accordance with the criteria and the procedures set out in these regulations. So there is, as I understand it, an emergency committee which advises the Director General. Can you take us through the chronology that was followed in this case with COVID-19 and what happened when?
So together with Article 12, if I may, you also have to read the definition of a FIC. And that means an extraordinary event which is determined to constitute a public health risk to other states through the international spread of disease, and to potentially require a coordinated international response. So there are three criteria: extraordinary nature of the event, public health risk to other states, and it requires an coordinated international response. So these are fairly loose, flexible criteria, a bit ambiguous actually, a bit vague. But why? Because they have to adapt to anything from this event to, again, a chemical spill in the Danube that kills people in several riparian countries. So when WHO, based on the discussion with the states, based on its analysis, thinks that the event has reached a certain level of gravity, it convenes this emergency committee. This is a committee of individual experts selected by the Director General from a roster, and basically advising the Director General. In this case, the committee met twice. The first time, on the 22nd of January, it could not reach consensus as to whether the event was an emergency or not. And actually,
can I just pause you there?
Yeah.
By now, 3 weeks have passed. The notification has taken place on the 31st of December. Why did 3 weeks pass before that committee met? And did the committee get it right in not reaching a consensus at that time?
These are difficult questions, of course, a bit speculative. The narrative is that based on China's reports, it wasn't yet clear for a bit, at least during January, that there was sustained human-to-human transmission. If the transmission was just limited to people that had gone into that famous wet market, then it was a different kind of event. If you had sustained transmission spreading like wildfire through the community as it was, that was a different event. And that's the, if you want, the chicken and the egg argument that is going on now. And of course, President Trump has put more fuel to the fire. So we can discuss whether it acted too late or not, but it convened the famous emergency committee on the 22nd of January. The committee could not reach a consensus. That would not prevent the Director General to take a decision, because the committee is advisory. And the Director General is not bound by that advice. So theoretically, it could also decide based on what he heard. But until now, and this is the sixth emergency, it's not the first, the Director General has always accepted lock, stock and barrel the advice from the emergency committee. That probably to seek a kind of political cover, that he or she acted according to the public health expertise. But obviously, it shifts a lot of power from the Director General, who is the executive authority under the IHR, to an advisory committee. Because basically the committee takes the decision and the Secretariat, the Director General, more or less rubber stamps it. And so that's an interesting shift of authority within this mechanism.
Just before we get to the second meeting of the committee, the emergency committee, a week later, can you just explain to us what the practical consequences of a determination that a public health emergency exists? In other words, what are the health-related consequences, but this opens another door. What are the potential economic consequences in terms of travel restrictions and other consequences that could flow?
Yes, well, the declaration of an emergency unlocks sort of certain powers within WHO, and in particular the authority to issue this famous temporary recommendation that WHO issued at the end of January. At the national level, in many countries, the declaration of an emergency or of a pandemic as it occurred in March can unlock certain internal powers, delegating authority to the government, unlocking contracts with pharmaceutical companies and so on. So there are also very important political and economic consequences within states that sort of reflect the finding by WHO. Otherwise, I mean, as you can see, states don't exactly wait for WHO's green or red light when there is a certain level of alarm and when the political bells are ringing. So in a way, this time, the timing was bad for the effectiveness of the IHR, because when WHO declared the emergency at the end of January, the world was already watching what was happening in China, and there was already a lot of alarm. Italy had blocked flights from China days earlier, and the US did it, I think, 1 or 2 days after the emergency. So in that sense, that alert function was a bit missing in this case, because the event was already so much in the media, there was so much attention and frenzy, that probably that declaration was more political symbolism than an actual public health alert. So, you know, it can have many different consequences.
Let's go now to the second emergency committee meeting, which was a week later, I think on the 30th of January. That decided this time there was a public health emergency. What had changed in that 1 week?
Well, two things. From a public health perspective, more epidemiological analysis and undeniable evidence of community spread. Politically, Dr. Tedros went personally to Beijing. He met with Xi Jinping in the Great Hall with the fresco of the Great Wall in the background. So there was also a sense of political buy-in from China. I don't want to overinterpret, but it's quite unusual that the executive head of WHO would travel and meet in such a spectacular way with the president of China. So there was probably also a successful attempt to ensure that China was playing according to the rules, was buying in on an act that in a way also reflected on what had gone wrong within its public health system. So two things, public health, but also certainly a sense of political realism in what had to be done.
I want to come back to something that I asked earlier. I mean, you're in lockdown, I'm in lockdown, everyone who's watching is in lockdown. Plainly, something went wrong on the timing, because we're in this very curious situation that the virus went rampant in and around Wuhan. It does not seem to have gone rampant in other parts of China, if the information is accurate, but it has become rampant around the rest of the world, in Europe, in North America, and it seems very soon in Africa and Asia and other places. On the basis of the information you have available to you, what could have happened differently that might have prevented the escape, if you like, of the virus into the wider community?
Well, you can also argue that things could have gone differently at the beginning. To begin with, that China had notified that event on the basis of whatever knowledge it had earlier than the 31st of December. That would have given quite an advance notice to the rest of the world. You can also argue that the emergency should have been declared earlier. I'm sure there will be plenty of inquiries after the end of this, and I hope that there will be some clarity on the chronology in those crucial few weeks. But it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that WHO was laggard and acted late. I think it is still at the end of January, it was still confined to China, and I think there were cases in Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, a handful of cases of countries around China. The main thing that should have happened is other countries preparing more quickly and early. That did not happen. And that, you know, part of the reason, in my view, why President Trump has sort of discovered WHO to, in a way, deflect from the inertia of the federal government in the early phases. Many countries were complacent. They thought that their problem would be contained to China. And to me, it's unfair to criticize WHO, like everybody was sitting on the hands until WHO gave them the green light. These are sort of mature, developed countries that could have known and should have known that a virus of that nature, that had precedence, for example, in SARS, so there was already experience, would have spread internationally. So that should have happened, and it's the responsibility of the countries concerned.
Sure. So we've focused on the internal regulations of the WHO, and I think we could spend a lot more time on that, but let's broaden the conversation to other areas that interconnect with international health laws and regulations. You and I know well, and many of the people watching know very well, that international institutional structures and the legal rules are not seamless. It's like a sort of series of small islands. If we can go into other areas, one of the consequences immediately that one thinks of with a virus like this is international transport and, of course, international trade in goods and movements of goods. What could be done to enhance, if you like, the seamlessness of the relationship between the World Health Organization and, say, the International Civil Aviation Organization on international transport, the WTO on trade in goods? The reason that I'm asking that is that we've seen basically each country within the Union, the European Union and beyond, has just gone off in its own devices. There's no sense that there have been international recommendations on air transport, no sense of international recommendations on circumstances in which certain goods can and cannot come in, which may or may not be contaminated, and so on and so forth. What are the lessons that we learn on that front in the field for, if you like, of transportation of human beings, transportation of goods, trading goods?
Yeah, there are many considerations there. First of all, the IHR were revised with this potential overlap very much in mind, with the need to be consistent with other bodies of international law. So that's why what happens under the IHR is very much based on context, but it has to be based on risk assessment. And so the idea of a proportional, necessary measures to prevent or control the spread of disease. And the negotiator has certain very much in mind human rights law. Human rights was totally missing from the older regulations. Now there are several provisions in the IHR that clearly limit what a state can do in terms of personal freedom, integrity of the person, and so on, but also trade law. The very fact that it's all based on a risk assessment, which is very similar to what happened, say, under the SPS or TBT agreement, shows that there was an attempt at consistency. As you said correctly, when things go out of control so badly, then it seems that there is almost like a knee-jerk reaction to try to close the door, beggar thy neighbor, and just take care of the immediate panic situation. So clearly what happened, and spilling way beyond the IHR, are implications for trade, because as you said, many countries actually played by the rules. They notified WHO that they were either suspending tariffs on imports of protective material or restricting the export. And there is an interesting report by the Peterson Institute of International Economics, I believe, that shows very clearly the rationality of this uncoordinated unilateral set of restriction that may sort of improve the situation in the very short term, but then they disrupt supply chains. They can lead to retaliation by other countries. They can deprive the restricting country from exporting other things. So, in terms of rational choice approach, there's clearly the need for a coordinated approach. And that depends in part, as you said, on WHO cooperating with other organizations. That cooperation is there. WHO has established a lot of network, a lot of relations with other organizations, ICAO being one, IATA, IMO, WTO, obviously UNHCR, and so on. But that's also has to be escalated to the political level. To me, one of the lessons of this crisis would be that in planning for the next pandemic, we need to have at least a consultative mechanism where states sit together and compare risk assessment, whether it's coordinated by WHO or by somebody else. But the rationality of what is going now is so evident that I hope that some sort of wiser minds will prevail in the future.
Yeah. I mean, you do see politics everywhere. To take an example on air flights, I mean, one of the things that seems to me to be staggering is flights are coming into Heathrow Airport in London from New York City. Thousands of people are arriving. There is absolutely no testing or information or temperature taking or anything. One of the things we know some countries did, Hong Kong, Taiwan, other parts of the world, immediately, already from the end of December, was to start asking questions to people flying in from particular places. So you've got these incredible divergences that are taking place. Is that something that can be addressed? And which body should address that? Is that for the WHO? Is that for the ICAO? Is it for some other body? Or is it just for each country to do what it wishes on its own basis?
No, I think I agree with you. There is a need for more coordination. A lot of barriers that are necessary, and they don't even sort of target the right situations. So they create a false sense of security. They don't prevent spread. They create the damages in the country, in other countries. So there is a lot of need for coordination. You sort of asked the right question: who should lead it? And here you go back to the sort of silos, vertical distribution of competencies around international organization. If you talk about flights, you obviously would have IATA and ICAO jumping up and down that they have to lead, and WHO can follow. But I don't think it should be seen in terms of turf. I think there should be almost like a blueprint for coordination. I always think that there is a role to play for the United Nations, because that to me, certain policy messages, certain sort of stimuli to create certain kind of institutions should come from the UN. Rather than from sectoral agencies that inevitably are controlled by certain epistemic communities, defend fiercely their own turf and so on. So, but wherever it comes from, you need a fairly sort of complex, but also agile and politically effective forum for consultations. Don't forget that on flights, often it's not the country that suspends the flight, the airlines that suspend the flight. And countries don't always have the possibility of prescribing to airlines whether to fly or not. They don't fly because the market is falling, they would lose money, or because they don't want to risk the health of the crews. So there's also the additional layer of complexity of private actors taking decisions that have major consequences from an economic and public health point of view.
Now you've evoked the subject of human rights. We could spend hours on that. We won't talk about it, but I just want to raise one issue. Going forward, particularly pending a vaccine, which seems some way off, there's a lot of talk about mobile phone and other technologies and the use of apps to follow people around, to trace people, to ensure that they are where they are, that they're coming into contact with certain people. Can you just say a word about who deals with that aspect of health-related issues? What are the human rights responsibilities of organizations like the WHO, and who sets the rules at that level? Is it set by each country, or do we move to some sort of regional or global arrangements on the balance between the well-being of the group and the well-being of the individuals?
Well, I'm not an expert in that, but obviously you ask all the big questions. I think there is a gap, a normative gap in that. Obviously, there are such evident human rights implications in terms of privacy, in terms of literally fundamental liberties, that there is a role to play for human rights organization. And I hope that monitoring bodies, the Human Rights Council, will try to exercise some oversight, because obviously many countries are introducing these kind of apps without any particular democratic process. And there's nothing better than a crisis to just streamline them and keep them in place after the pandemic to prevent the next pandemic. So like after 9/11, I think that we will witness a considerable erosion of privacy and of liberties. I think it's irreversible. The point is, how far can it go, and how can we control it? I don't see major kind of oversight at the international level. ITU, as you know, had ambitions to have a better regulatory role in the internet, but with a strong pushback from the industry, from ICANN and so on. Otherwise, a lot is left, as you said, to the regulation in each country, but also to the power of the industry. These apps are developed in many cases by the big tech, and just sort of bought over by governments. I was reading on the newspaper that the two polytechnic universities in Switzerland, one in Zurich, one in Lausanne, that are very strong on innovation, have already worked on different kind of apps that can be used in peacetime, but still to provide early warning of possible health problems. And these will be sold straight to Google and the big tech. Probably the government will just follow what these big techs are offering. So that's a totally different, not totally different, but quite different sets of problems that flies lower than public international law in a way, but shapes very dramatically human rights outcomes for us.
Sure. I'm going to finish with one final question, and that goes to the situation in the future. I mean, we are where we are. We need to get ourselves out of this mess. It's not the moment to be, I think, pointing the finger of blame as the body is piling up. But the time will come where some very tough questions are going to have to be asked. And there's going to have to be some sort of inquiry, probably at the international level. Who is best placed to carry out that inquiry? And what are the principal questions that inquiry should be addressing?
Well, after Ebola, there was already quite a number of inquiries. We already had a precedent of notifiers in the past. WHO commissioned a number of reviews and inquiries by groups of experts, and I don't think there was a particular attempt to influence those experts. So the findings sometimes are very critical with WHO. The UN Secretary General put up a high-level panel that came with very far-reaching recommendations around the same time. Plus, there were reviews by national governments, European Union, Council of Europe. I mean, it was a whole sort of line of official or academic reviews. So I expect the same to happen after this. I think part of it will have to be led by WHO, because public health should continue to be the driver. But I would see, again, an important role, if it is played well, by the United Nations. It has to be done credibly, but it is able probably to be more holistic in its analysis than if WHO does it. In terms of the hard question, obviously, there will be some inquiry who did what or what went wrong, but I hope we will not be too consumed by that. To me, as you said, we need to plan for the next pandemic, because the number of diseases that is spreading internationally is accelerating. When I was young, I never heard every 2-3 years in the front page of the newspaper of a new disease, Ebola, SARS, MERS, pandemic influenza, and so on. So this is our future. And we may not have too long a peacetime to prepare. So the hard question would be, what is politically realistic and effective from a public health point of view? Strengthening the IHR, strengthening WHO, but fixing some of the big gaps that go beyond that institution. We mentioned one, coordination on trade and travel. Another one is to have at least some ideas, some political agreement on what will happen when we have a vaccine and an antiviral. Who will get it at what price? Who will control what is seen as a public good more and more? How to share pathogens, because we need the virus to prepare the vaccine. And that's a big discussion going on now. So there are several big questions that go way beyond health, and that would be very challenging, I think, to address, because they fall in different political, legal, and epistemic communities.
Sure. Thank you very much, Gian Luca. We should also add to the list of course, issues of food and agriculture and the role of the FAO, if, as some people are saying, the starting point for all of this was a problem with wet markets in Wuhan.
Not only WHO, but also OIE, the Organization for Animal Health.
Yeah.
That's what we call the One Health approach, because most of the diseases that we're talking about have animal origins. So you need a very solid interface between animal health, food production, and human health. And so that's a work in progress, but it has to be strengthened much more than it is at the time.
Very good. Constantinos, back over to you. I see that there are quite a few questions that have come in, and we rely on you, thank you very much, to guide us to those questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. Now we have received a number of questions over the course of the discussion, and my colleagues and I have selected the ones that seem to appear more frequently, and indeed those that fit most directly into your very interesting conversation. Now, Natalie Jones and some other attendees are asking, do you think there is a link to, that there is likely to be a future revision of the international health regulations in light of what happened? And if so, what do you think are the key reforms needed? And related to this question, what is, in your opinion, the areas for further improvement of the international? Specifically, should we be incorporating sanctions into that treaty?
Do you want me to address one by one, or to gather a few?
I
can respond.
We can start with this one, and we can follow with the
Sure.
other questions subsequently.
Yeah. I hope that there will be a political will to, in part, revise the IHR, not to go back to the drawing board, because I think it's unrealistic, but to address some of what, in my view, are design weaknesses of the IHR. Until now, and that's been, I must say, a bit frustrating for me as a lawyer, there has been an absolute refusal by the public health community to consider reopening the text. So we only talk about implementation, improve the implementation, fill some gaps with initiatives taken outside the IHR. That can be politically expedient, but to me, it weakens the integrity of a legal instrument, because either we don't have a legal instrument, we have like a soft declaration, but if we do have it, we need to protect its effectiveness and its integrity. So I hope there will be a willingness to look at the design. And to me, the most important things to address are, first, as I said, the mechanism for alert. You cannot wait for an emergency. You can start acting much earlier. If the IHR has a fighting chance, is at a much earlier stage. IHR is marginal now because the situation has gone way beyond the scope and the purpose of the IHR. So level of alert, you need a system of compliance, assessment, and monitoring as part of the IHR. That is missing. So it has to be built into, say, like environmental convention. It doesn't have to be antagonistic and almost like judicial. It should be like managerial, like in environmental field, of assistance, of dialogue, of identifying gaps. Sorry. And third, we need to look again at the assumption, very optimistic, that WHO's recommendation would be the exercise of a strong sort of epistemic authority. Just because they are based on the IHR and they come from WHO, countries comply. And that's evidently not been the case. And that to me is like the original sin, if I can call it that way, because it goes back to the SARS crisis when WHO was very effective. So that model was codified into an instrument and applied across a broad range of events. But some of the assumptions have to be retested. I don't see, frankly, WHO becoming a sanctionatory body. It's not in the culture of WHO, it's not the mission of WHO. You can argue whether you could have a naming and shaming exercise. Maybe. I don't see countries exposing themselves to the kind of scrutiny. So you need to probably add more to the size of the carrots rather than the sticks. And I will repeat again, they need to have a forum for coordination at an earlier stage when countries are not so locked in politically and can still compare their own risk assessment and try to have a more rational collective approach. That to me would be a huge improvement to what we have now. And I think Constantinos is frozen now.
No, I'm here.
No, I'm frozen, okay.
Now, this is a question perhaps for Professor Sands. What role does or should the UN Security Council have in relation to COVID-19 and similar pandemics? And also, a further question, and I will address that as well. How do you see the world order changing post this pandemic, especially, and we have received this question quite a lot tonight, in light of the United States freezing funding for WHO?
I mean, I think the two questions are connected. And of course, when you're in the midst of a situation such as this, it is a crisis, it's very hard to see clearly exactly which way it's going to go. But there are a number of options that could go. The writer Yuval Harari has indicated that one option is we go the nationalist route. We close the barriers, we build walls, every country to itself. And that, in a sense, seems to be what President Trump in the United States is saying the route that he wants to take. The alternative route, which frankly is my preference, is to a route which says, actually, no, what we need is greater international cooperation and greater coordination. We are all in this together. And in particular, if we're going to get out of this together in terms of the direction on the protection of health, but also on the economic direction, keeping people in employment, keeping people in jobs, you need trade flowing. That requires cooperation. So that would be my preferred route. And I hope it is the route that is taken. But we are occupying a populist and nationalist moment right now. And you can quite easily see that in the decisive weeks and months ahead, that if the economic consequences go really belly up, it could head in a very bad direction. So it is extraordinarily important that countries come together in the coming weeks and cooperate. And of course, the mechanisms include legal mechanisms. On the question about the Security Council, I mean, I posed the question to Gian Luca. I think there does need to be an inquiry. I mean, there are proposals coming back to the question of sanctions, of cases being brought against this country or that country or an organization or whatever. Whilst we're in the midst of this, I'm not sure it's particularly useful to be engaging in that conversation. I also have doubts as to whether over the long run, that is the most useful way to go forward. But it is plain that there's going to have to be an inquiry. The difficulty, of course, of putting it in the context of the Security Council is that a number of countries have a veto power. And one of those countries is, of course, China. And what China did or did not do in a timely fashion, what the United States did or did not do in a timely fashion, or Britain, or France, or Russia, or any other country, will be part of a proper and necessary inquiry. So I'm with Gian Luca. I think this needs to be put into the hands of an independent group of individuals who are of impeccable independence and integrity, who can provide a warts and all exposition, first on the facts of what happened. And once we know what the facts are, we still don't know what the facts are, we can then draw the consequences.
May I add something on the Security Council? Because it's interesting. Security Council jumped early on, for example, on HIV/AIDS. There was in 2000, so the very early exposure of the Security Council to a health problem. And the meeting was chaired by Al Gore, at the time the Vice President of the United States. So at that level of political attention. And then Security Council jumped again on Ebola. You remember September 2014, declaring it a potential threat to international security. But now the Council has been very silent on COVID. Frankly, the Ebola outbreak pales in front of what we are living now. So you wonder why. There was a meeting last week Obviously now it's all online, and that's another problem. That, for example, Russia is very reluctant to adopt major decisions online. They would like physical meetings. The other ambassadors say, no way, are we sort of running health risk for ourselves? So the pandemic is also having an impact on the governance of international organization. But there was a sort of meeting, virtual meeting with the Secretary General on COVID, and the statement by the Secretary General is available on the UN website. Still, the Security Council seemed to take a piecemeal. They are looking at the impact of COVID, for example, on peacekeeping operations, the impossibility of rotating troops and having the same contingent stay in theater for indefinite period of time. Positive effect, like possibly ceasefires, like in Yemen at the time. But it's not taking a general position on COVID. I don't mean that it would be necessarily a positive thing if he sort of sank his teeth also on this disease. But I find it an interesting contrast between what is going on now, on the one hand, and HIV and Ebola on the other hand.
Excellent. So we have 3 more questions and 15 minutes to go. So the first question from Marco: which is the geographical scope of application of the international health regulations? Are they linked to state territory or state jurisdiction? I think that's a very important question. And another question from Robert: what are the international responsibilities of private companies in this area? The WHO is already closely linked to private companies in some areas, and there was criticism of private companies rushing for Ebola medicines without full evidence of applying research protocols. How can and should WHO and international institutions regulate these activities? And last question from Selam: can we also consider the question or the lesson learned from COVID-19 for other emergencies, for other global emergencies, for example, environmental and climate-related emergencies?
So, should I start? Okay. The geographic scope is easy. It's a global instrument. The IHR have 196 parties, all 194 WHO member states, plus Liechtenstein and the Holy See that are not members. So it's a sort of genuinely global instrument. Excellent question whether that's based on territory or jurisdiction. The assumption, even though it's implicit more than explicit, is based on jurisdiction. So we expect France, for example, the UK, they are responsible for the overseas territories. So it's also based on the exercise of jurisdiction, and imagine events occurring on sort of military ships like the US aircraft carrier. I would say that even then you have a clear responsibility of the state to apply the IHR. So I would use a jurisdictional approach. Maybe I'll quickly on the private companies. First of all, I think there's a lot of criticism against WHO, sometimes warranted, sometimes not. I don't think, as far as WHO is concerned, that there was some kind of complicity with pharmaceutical companies to cut corners and sort of have unethical development of countermeasures. WHO really tried on the one hand to facilitate, but on the other hand, insofar as it had some kind of responsibility, some kind of control, always apply bioethical principles. The point remains, however, that if you want a vaccine now, you need to cut some corners, still within the realm of accepted protocols of clinical trials. So it's not so much obscure ulterior motives of pharmaceutical companies, but it's also the pressure of having a countermeasures in a much, much more compressed period of time. If you want to have it, you need to sacrifice something. The point is, it has to be kept within certain lines that don't sort of breach ethical principle or don't lead to the manufacturing of dangerous products. But I don't think it's correct to say that WHO somehow acquiesced to this kind of unethical behavior.
I mean, just coming back on Gian Luca's first question on the global application, of course, it's not entirely complete, the global application. One area that is missing, and I've been fascinated in this, is reading what's happened in Taiwan. which of course is not a member of the WHO and is effectively excluded by China from participating. I know there have been a number of controversies over the last few days. I don't want to get into those. What I'm fascinated about is that the authorities in Taiwan moved incredibly fast. By the 31st of December, they were screening passengers coming from flights from Wuhan into Taiwan. And that is very telling for me. Why was that experience, or why could that experience not be a basis for understanding how you move early to address such matters? So the exclusion of any territory on something like this, it seems to me, is something that needs to be addressed. The third question, I think, is a fascinating one. And I think many of us have been thinking a lot over the last month in our enforced solitary isolation. If this is what happens with a single virus, the lethalness of which is terrible, but limited to 1% of people who get it, if that, what on earth are we going to do when it comes to the consequences of climate change, which I think is what the question was going to. This really is a wake-up call. It's a real wake-up call. Not only, as Gian Luca has rightly said, for the next pandemic, what if COVID-19 had a mortality rate of 50%, not 1%? That presumably is envisageable in the foreseeable future. But if we're unable to get our act together as a global community on this, what prospect for something like climate change? So looking on the bright side, I hope that this will concentrate minds away from the kind of knee-jerk response from President Trump into a more reflective response. What are the lessons to be learned? We're in the middle of this. We have no idea what comes next. My own feeling, for what it's worth, is this is going to be a very long haul. Normality is not around the corner. We will not be going to football matches. We will not be going to the cinema. We will not be going to the theatre for a long time to come. And that will concentrate our minds on what we ought to be doing for even bigger issues than this. Now, whether we are capable, whether we have the institutions and resources to do that, is another question entirely. But I think we need to start thinking hard about those questions. And those are questions for international law and international cooperation.
And if I can follow up, I think also following up on what Philippe said on Taiwan, it shows, I think, a number of literally principles that have to be followed. First, early action, preparedness, integrate the consideration of other values like human rights, but also see preparation as an investment. I think a lot of the problem is that in many countries, there is not this sense of investment like an insurance policy for a probable likely event. We don't know when it will happen, we don't know where it will come from. And so in rational terms, it doesn't pay politically, economically to stockpile a huge amount of protective equipment, maybe useful, maybe not. ICU units that we don't need now, investment in the public health service. So one of the problems has been the lack of investment, even in well-functioning public health services like Italy. I hope one of the lessons is to look strategically at investment, the things that are done now, not to respond to some profit logic, but to be prepared in an event, so sooner or later will certainly come back. And that applies to diseases as much to climate change or other potential disasters.
Okay, so two more questions. The first one comes back to the US decision to halt WHO funding. And there are two sub-questions. One is whether the US has a legal basis under international law to do that. And the second relates to dispute settlement, specifically Article 56 of the International Health Regulation, which provides for disputes between states to be resolved by arbitration and other routes. So the question is, do you see a role for Article 56 dispute settlement to play in this case?
Should I start? Yeah. So no, there is no legal basis for a unilateral decision by the US to stop funding WHO. But the US has not sort of particularly bothered in the past about legal niceties when certain political decisions were taken. Also, I haven't seen the details of that decision, if there are details. So what is exactly the US blocking at this time? Are they whatever assessed contribution they still have to pay? Are they voluntary contribution? And if so, how much? Voluntary contribution for which program, due when? So the consequences are very much based on the granularity of what the US intends to do. But I don't think there is a legal basis unless we appeal to sort of fairly abstract notions of necessity that frankly are very sort of, would be a bit quaint in this case. The dispute settlement is very loose. Article 56 has never been applied. And basically it covers a typical peaceful means of settlement, optional arbitration, and no country has opted for arbitration. So at this point, the provision is totally inoperative, but it gives authority to the Director General. The parties can refer the dispute to the Director General as a kind of conciliation good offices. And that to me would be more promising, but it's never been used either. So what are the two lessons? The first is many of the disputes that can arise in the crisis are not the kind of disputes that lend themselves to a lengthy settlement process, an arbitration that will provide an award in 5 years, but they need to be sorted now to a practical level. So I think there has to be a different mechanism, which is not necessarily so adjudicatory. And second, that probably we need to look at more tools, because it would be useful to have, if not sort of arbitral award, at least the building of a jurisprudence or testing certain provisions of the IHR. For example, to try to have some clarity how far countries can go in doing a unilateral things that are not necessarily provided by the IHR. So you need also that kind of clarity that the building of some kind of case law would provide. So this time, that article has totally been untested. To me, it would be promising. There could be a promising role for the Director General, almost like conciliatory nature, and I hope that countries will use it in the future. It doesn't need to be under public scrutiny. It can be something behind the scenes and confidential, but it will still be a useful role to play for WHO in this case.
I mean, these two questions raise issues of responsibility and criminality. And of course, that is naturally part of any discussion on international law. The reactions, I mean, I'm with Gian Luca. There is no basis. The United States is responsible for its financial contributions and the suspension unilaterally by the American president, for what it's worth. It cannot be effective as a matter of international law. But of course, it raises also the question of responsibility. The editor of the Lancet magazine, a very reputable medical magazine in the United Kingdom, reacted to Donald Trump's decision by saying this was a crime against humanity. I'm sure he wasn't using that in a legal technical term, because I think that would be a difficult argument to sustain. But I understand the instinct. It has outraged many people, and it will probably have the unintended consequence of bringing greater support to the WHO from other quarters. It's not the moment to be doing this. This is a moment for solidarity. But there is a bigger issue going along as to how governments have acquitted themselves. I hope I've made clear my view that this is not the moment to be putting the finger of blame at individual governments or individual politicians. We have to get ourselves out of this difficulty as people are dying. That's got to be the priority. But when the dust has settled, a lot of people have lost many things, lives and loved ones, but also businesses have lost vast amounts of money. I sit from time to time as an arbitrator in investor-state arbitration, and just watching these issues unfurl, I sit on cases where there are allegations of wrongdoing by governments, inadequate reactions, and so on and so forth. I mean, just without mentioning any particular governments, but sitting in London, one doesn't have to look very far to see what gives a very good impression of being less than fully competent responses to certain things in terms of the supply of protective equipment, the need to carry out tests, and so on and so forth. So at some point there will be a reckoning. Some organizations have gone further. The Henry Jackson Society put out, I suspect rather too early, a call for legal proceedings against one particular country, China. I'm not sure, again, how useful it is at this point to be engaging in that sort of conversation. But at some point, no doubt, there will be consequences for all of this, and it will work its way into legal discussions. And I think there is a need to step back and ask ourselves the question, as a legal community, as part of the international law community, what is the most socially useful thing we can do to stop this from happening again? That seems to me to be the central question.
And if I may, just a 1 second follow-up, I think it's very important what Philippe said. Looking at the probably the midterm future, I would see a role of the General Assembly, for example, for literally stating the main principles that should sort of be the rallying cry of the whole international community in a case like this. I mean, we have declarations on decolonization, on aggression, on friendly relations, on sovereignty over natural resources. They have shaped the development of international law. What about literally a statement at that level of solemnity on some of the main legal and political principles that have to underpin the behavior of the international community? I think international law needs to develop, for example, on the question of responsibility. That do sort of the environmental law principle, principle 21, you can exploit your resources, but you shall not damage the environment of other countries. Can it be transposed by analogy to a situation like this, where you don't necessarily exploit your virus, but you're responsible to prevent this kind of situations? I think the law is very loose and very questionable. I think there is a need to develop also to some clarity about the fundamental principles of law. And I would say a declaratory role or a progressive development role for the General Assembly, maybe even for the International Law Commission.
Now, Professor Sands, Professor Burci, thank you very much for this most insightful conversation, and thanks very much to BIICL for offering the platform to do so, and all those of you at home for your participation. Professor Sands, may I ask you to conclude today's event? Thank you very much.
Yes, I thank you and the BIICL community, and I do want to thank Gian Luca also for giving us his time. I've learned so much listening to you, Gian Luca, and just preparing for a conversation in an area that I'm certainly not expert on, but I'm increasingly fascinated and interested by, and how wonderful it is to have attracted hundreds of participants on a process like this. So my sincere thanks to BIICL, my sincere thanks to you, Gian Luca, and with that, we close the meeting.
Thank you very much.